All right, so today we're going to be talking about the setup for a new fiscal year in acquisitions, and a lot of this is kind of actually covering territory we've already covered in previous sessions, but doing it specifically from the perspective of setting up a fiscal year. So this can be useful for those libraries that are maybe brand new to acquisitions. This is the first time you're setting anything up, but you're starting it in the coming fiscal year. Or it can be useful for those libraries who are already using acquisitions and are just getting ready to start that new fiscal year. We'll cover it from both perspectives. They do converge pretty heavily. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to be looking at the fiscal year closeout. We're not going to cover this heavily. We did a session on that a couple months ago to get everybody prepared for it. If anyone has not yet completed that fiscal year closeout, that's fine. You won't be able to necessarily conduct the steps that we talk about today, at least not all of them, until you've performed that closeout. But we're not going to go into a great deal of detail about how to perform the closeout. Instead, we'll sort of talk about how that closeout rolls into the setup of the new fiscal year. We'll also talk about creating new funding sources if needed. Oftentimes, libraries that are already fully set up in Evergreen acquisitions do not need new funding sources, but it's not unusual to have one that's sort of special to 1 year that's not a standard one for you. And that would be the time that you as an existing library would set one up. For those watching the recording, if you are new to acquisitions and you're creating a funding source for the first time, we will kind of go over how to do that. It's the same either way, whether you are creating all funding sources from scratch or you're just creating a single funding source, a grant or something like that as part of your new fiscal year setup. We'll also create new funds. Most of your funds, if you're already set up, are going to roll over via the fiscal year closeout process. But if you are creating new ones for a new segment of purchasing, a special project or something like that, then you would create those at this time. And then the big thing that regardless of how many funding sources and funds you did or did not create, the big thing that comes along with the fiscal year start is the application of credit and allocation of funds. So that's where we're going to look at as well today. So a lot of this really is a little bit of a review of the stuff that we talked about in the administrative training session. So if you were not present at that or have not watched the recording, this is going to cover a lot of that same stuff. It's just from the perspective of setting up the fiscal year as opposed to from the perspective of kind of that broader perspective of how those things work. So today is a little bit more hands-on, which is why I do encourage you, if you are prepared to do it, if you've done your fiscal year closeout, to go ahead and walk along with me on getting these steps completed. If you're ready to, you may not have the information you need to do that, and that's fine. And then I do have an hour and a half set for today. I don't think we're going to take that amount of time for these 4 steps. So I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time for questions if there are any. So we're going to start by talking about the end of year procedure, just kind of a recap of that. We talked about this in March, is that the main thing that you do as part of your end of year procedure, first you clean up all of your kind of outstanding loose ends. So purchase orders that have not yet been received need to be marked as received. Those that literally have not been received can remain open. Invoices need to be closed out as items on them have been received and finalized. And once all of that paperwork has been sorted through, then you basically run a process in Evergreen on your funds that closes them out for the year, that makes it so that you cannot spend any more money out of that fund, and then rolls over those funds for the new year. So basically propagates a new set of funds that are exactly like the funds from the previous year, whether it's adult fiction and juvenile fiction and adult DVDs and juvenile DVDs, etc. Whatever your funds were for the current fiscal year, when you close them out, if you have propagation set to true for that particular fund, then you'll have a new version of that fund automatically created for the new year. If you have rollover set to true, then any remaining money left in the fund will also then make its way into the new fund. Now, if you don't have rollover set to true, then that money is still going to be zeroed out in the existing year fund, the year you're closing out. It's just not going to roll over into the new year. And so we'll look at that in a second. The main thing that I want to talk about in the context of setting up your new fiscal year is that when the time comes to do that, the first thing you want to do is double check that your closeout functioned as expected, that every fund that you expected to propagate has propagated, that any rollovers that you expected to move from the last year to the new year have done that, and that it's actually being reflected properly in your funds. So you're going to want to check your closed funds, the funds for the previous fiscal year, and make sure that all of your encumbrances are blank. Any encumbrances from the previous fiscal year should have moved over into the new fiscal year. You want to make sure that your balances are zero. There should be no money left in those funds that could be spent. And that closed funds are marked inactive. That means that no one could accidentally use that fund to try to purchase something when they're going through the purchase order process. So you want to make sure that all of this stuff is true. Now, in some cases, if you don't have rollover set to true, you might still show some balances. How you deal with that is something that you kind of have to work out within the context of your library. Do you maintain those balances in your paperwork? Do you zero them out? You know, the reason that you're not rolling that over is because your county takes your money back. Then that should still reflect a balance of zero, but you may need to do that manually to get it there manually. But in order to sort of start your new fiscal year with a clean slate, you do want to make sure that your balances from the previous fiscal year are showing at zero. And then you want to check your funds for the new year. If you have propagated your funds to the new year, and I do recommend that libraries choose propagation when they're setting up their funds. You don't have to do rollover if there is an accounting reason not to from your funding source. But I do recommend that you do the propagation unless it is sort of a one-off fund. You know, if you have a fund for something grant-based, you're probably not going to want to propagate that to the next year because you're not going to be spending out of that fund anymore. But for any of those funds that you use from year to year, it is probably going to be better, and it's certainly going to be easier and faster for you to propagate them rather than set them up fresh every year. So just my recommendation is that when you set up funds, unless it's a one-off thing, if it's the type of thing that you plan to use again in the future, set those funds to propagate so that you don't have to create them from scratch every year. So once you have propagated your funds after closing out your old fiscal year, you'll want to check those and make sure that any encumbrances that did remain are showing up in there. So, you know, if you had an outstanding order that hadn't come in yet, then that money is still going to be encumbered. You can close out that fund, even though it has money encumbered against it. It's just going to roll over that encumbrance to the new year. And you do have the ability to roll over encumbrances, but not balances. So, you know, again, if your county takes your money back at the end of the year, but you do still have some outstanding orders that you're waiting for, you can set it up in a way where those encumbrances roll over, and therefore you're still able to pay for them, but the balance does not roll over. So that's an option in setup. And you want to make sure that if you have any encumbrances, that you then have a negative balance. If you have zero encumbrances, if when the new fund propagated and the encumbrances rolled over, there weren't zero encumbrances, then your balance is going to be zero. But if there's any encumbrances at all, you should be showing a negative balance. So let's actually look at that in practice instead of just listening to me talk about it and try to describe it. So we're going to go into our fund administration. So this is under the administration menu under under acquisitions administration, and then from there under fund administration. And just for the sake of not trying to find it again, I've gone straight there from my link. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to come and use this year filter to make sure that we're looking at each year kind of in isolation. And a lot of you may have noticed, if you've worked with your acquisitions administration at all, that this filter is set by default. And so sometimes you may come in and you see the current, you're going to see the current year just by default. And the way that you set up your year within, when you set up your funds, how you mark this year, some of you may have it marked as 2022 rather than 2023. That could make this filter a little confusing. So if you are not finding the funds you're expecting to find on this page, I'd suggest the first thing you do is clear your filter, because it is going to be set automatically and that can be a little confusing. In this case, I'm going to leave it because it is actually the filter I want, because I wanted to filter down to the funds that I have closed, which were the funds from last year, or from this year that we've got 10 days left in, which I am calling the 2023 fiscal year. And I did close out this fund, so it should be showing all of those things that we wanted to look for. So essentially, we want to make sure that the encumbrances are blank, the balance is 0, and that it's not active. So when we look at this fund just in the grid here, we see that the active designator is set to no, and we do see that the balance is 0. Now the encumbrances are not showing up right here. I think I can add them by coming up to this menu. I can also see them by clicking on the training link here, and that's the name of the fund. So that actually brings the fund up. And so I can see the balance here as well, which is also 0, and I can see that my encumbrance is blank. And so when you have 0 encumbrances, it doesn't show as a 0, it shows as a blank, and that's what you want to look for. So we know that the 2023, the previous fiscal year fund for training, has been closed as part of that end of year process. So I can sort of check off all of this. But now I want to check for my new year. This fund should have propagated. So I want to check that that propagation happened properly and that this fund is ready to go for this year. And so I'm going to come back up to my year filter, and I'm going to keep my operator as is exactly, but I'm going to change the year itself to 2024 and click apply. And I think, and I do see that my training fund has shown up for 2024 because that filter hasn't been applied and I am in the 2024 year. So I have the fund, it's named the same, same owner, same currency type. It is now active, so the 2023 version of this fund was not active. The 2024 version now is, which means that when I go in to make purchases, this is a fund that I could actually apply to those purchases. And then I also have my combined balance. So when I rolled over the remaining money from this fund from last year, when I closed out last year's fund, that money rolled over into this year's fund. So even though I haven't yet applied any credit here, I already have a $1,500 balance because that's how much money I had left over at the end of the last fiscal year. Let's open it up, and we can see that the encumbrances are still blank. And the reason for that is that I have no outstanding purchases. So ideally, you want this to be blank or negative. So if you have any outstanding purchases, this is going to show up as negative. If you have closed everything out and all of your orders have been received, then that's great for you. You deserve to celebrate that, I think. And if that's the case, you're going to see a blank encumbrance. Does that make sense? Is that something that anyone who has already done the end of year process is able to confirm that they're seeing when they take a look? Or are there any questions? All right. Well, if you have performed your end of year closeout, I would definitely suggest taking a look to make sure that this has all gone through. If you have not, make sure that you've done that and make sure that this is all showing as expected before you start any new fund administration for the new fiscal year. Let's see. So if there are funds from a previous year that are still showing active, how would we deactivate them? So they should have deactivated automatically when the year was closed out. But if they did not, I'm sure the best way to show this, because I'm not sure I've got any active ones I can look at. I mean, this is all fake, so I can just use this, I suppose. If I select this fund and I come up here, I can edit it. So basically I select the fund that's still showing as active that I don't want to show as active. I can come to the action menu and I can click edit selected. And then there is an active checkbox. So I could check this or uncheck it. to show it then as deactive. So, if this 2023 fund for some reason was still showing as active after I'd closed out the year, I could deactivate it manually that way. And so that's really helpful too when you have a situation like, maybe you have one fund that you only want to use during certain times of the year. Maybe it's grant-based, or it has to do with a fundraiser from your friends group or something like that. And so you only want it to be active and available to pay for purchases for a very small window. You can sort of activate and deactivate that outside of the end of year process as well, manually that way. And that way, once it's been deactivated, you don't have to worry about whether or not people could accidentally still use that fund. But if it was something that you have done your end of year process for, and it was supposed to propagate and it's still showing as active in the previous year, that might be something that you send our way to take a look at, because that shouldn't be happening once you close out. Unless it was, if that was not something that you included in your end of year process, that would be why it wouldn't be deactivating. All right. So once you have confirmed that your end of year process is complete, that all of the funds that you were looking to bring forward into the new year are behaving as expected, then the next thing you're going to want to do is sort of figure out what, if any, new funding sources you have for this year and new funds that you may be adding. And so for a lot of libraries that are already engaged in Evergreen, this process is more about kind of one-off situations. So if you got a new grant this year, that's probably the most common reason you might set up a new funding source. But it's also possible that you have a new source of money from somewhere, and obviously you're going to want to make sure that that is reflected. So regardless of where it's coming from, if you have any funding sources that are not reflected in your previous year, then you're going to want to create those before you move forward with the new year. So to create a new funding source, you're just going to come into the Funding Sources tab within the Fund Administration, and you'll create your new funding source the way you would sort of starting from scratch, and as we talked about back in that administrative session that we did. So creating a new funding source is fairly straightforward. You basically just need to name it and then provide a code. And I've talked about this before, that my recommendation is that you set a standard in your library for what those funding sources codes are. And that can be, it can be a standard set of abbreviations. It can have numbers involved. Just make sure that you have a general understanding of what that code is and what that standard is. So you put in your source name, your code, you mark whether it's active or inactive. And when you're first setting up your new fiscal year, you might want to mark everything as inactive until you're ready to actually activate it. I know in my previous library, we would not be able to start spending until usually September, even if the fiscal year started in July. So in a case like this, we would probably not mark this active until we were ready to start spending from it. You'll set your currency, and then you also want to make sure that your owner is set to the correct scope. And generally speaking, libraries will set the funding source owner to their system level, while funds may be at the branch level. It's up to your library how you want to do that, but that's, I think, the standard. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new funding source. Let's say that we got a grant for this year. And I'm going to create a code for it. And there is absolutely no standardization in place because Bunkum does not have any acquisitions in place. So I'm going to make up my own standard right now. And it's already marked as active, so I'm going to keep that as is. I'm going to set this to US dollars, and I'm going to set this up at my system level. So it was scoped to the branch level, but I want it at the system level. I'll go ahead and save it. And of course, you'll see that nothing's showing up here. That's because currently I am scoped to the branch level here, I take it up to my system level, then it's going to show up. And that is something that, if you're in this fund administration interface and you're not seeing what you expect to see, the first thing to look for is any filters that are applied. The second thing to look for is whether or not you're scoped correctly. If you're not seeing anything and you don't have any filters, scope up to your system level if you're at your branch level. So this funding source exists now. It doesn't have any money in it. I haven't actually received the check for that grant yet. Obviously with a grant, I guess I wouldn't receive the check till I've spent the money, but I don't have anything showing up here yet. That's okay. That's going to be a later step. The important thing is simply that it is active and that it exists. So that's the first step with actually setting up anything new. I think I stopped using the slideshow for a second, so let's catch up. Next, we're going to do a new fund. So these are probably slightly more common than new funding sources. You might create a new fund because you've decided to pay for things slightly different or record how you're paying for things slightly differently. Perhaps in the past you had one fund for all juvenile materials and you've decided this year you're going to have one fund for juvenile books and a separate one for juvenile DVDs. So you need to create a new fund for those juvenile DVDs. So you'd come into your fund administration interface and you'd come into your funds tab, and we're just going to set up a new fund by clicking on the new fund button here. So just like setting up the funding source, it's fairly straightforward. There are a few more fields to fill out, but it is generally speaking the same process. So I'm going to call this laptops. And I'm going to code it actually the same as my funding source. That way nobody just buys a laptop outside the grant money and uses this one. And it's important that your codes not only follow that standard, but also are fairly obvious what they're for, because the codes are what show up in the drop-down menu when you're actually creating a purchase order. And you're setting which fund that money is going to come from. And you want to make sure that whoever's creating that purchase order selects the correct fund when they're setting up the purchase order or the selection list or whatever they're setting up. So I make sure that it has the word grant in it, so people don't just buy any laptop with this, but only the ones that are specific for this grant. Now, one of the big differences, of course, between a funding source and a fund is that a funding source is static. Once you've set it up, you add money to it as you get it, which is for most cases going to be on an annual basis, but it is not specific to any year. You don't set a new one up every year unless it's a brand new funding source, and you don't have to worry about closing it out. Instead, funds are actually going to be a new fund every year. And that's why that propagation step is useful, because instead of going and setting up your adult fiction fund every year, you're basically creating a new one automatically when you close out the old one. So your adult fiction fund is a different fund every year. It's stored differently in the database, but functionally looks about the same. So one of the key things when you're setting up your fund is making sure that you're setting it for the correct fiscal year. Now, what your naming convention for that year is may vary from library to library. Some libraries call our current fiscal year the 2022 fiscal year. Others call it the 2023 fiscal year. So whatever naming convention is standard in your accounting practices is what you're going to want to use. Because of the way that I have already done my closeout, I have already determined that the funds for the upcoming fiscal year are going to be called the 2024 fiscal year. So that's what I'm going to set as my year here. And while I set my funding source to the system, I'm going to say in this particular case, the fund that I'm setting up here is just for the PAC branch to purchase laptops with this grant. And, potentially this grant was just for the PAC branch, or maybe every branch that's using it is going to get their own fund. But I'm going to set it up at the system level, or I'm sorry, at the branch level. Again, you can choose not to make the fund active immediately. I'm going to go ahead and make it active right away. but you can choose to wait and activate it when you're ready to start actually spending out of it. And then my currency type is going to be US dollars. Now, because this is a grant, I actually do not want to propagate it. By the time I close out this fiscal year, this grant will be over, and I'm not going to need the fund to show up next year. So I'm not going to check the propagate box. If you're doing more standard funds, like a fiction fund or something like that, this propagation box, I would recommend you check it. Rollover, you would check if that is a practice that you engage in terms of your accounting for your library. If you have to return the money to the funding source at the end of the fiscal year, obviously you're not going to want to roll it over. My balance stop percent, and we've talked about this in previous sessions. This is basically the point at which users will no longer be able to spend money from this account. So I'm going to say that's going to happen at 98%. When 98% of the money from this fund has been spent, no more purchase orders will be able to draw money from it. I will warn my staff that they are approaching this limit when they get to 95%. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And so I'm set to 2023. Let's move on to 2024. So now I have two funds for 2024. I have the training fund, which propagated from the previous year when I did my closeout. And I have my new fund for laptops that I created just now. Both are active, but only the one that propagated from last year has a balance because I've not actually added any money. And that's going to be what we do next. That's typically the kind of the most important part of setting up your new fiscal year, is making sure you've got money to spend. But are there any questions about fund creation at this point? All right, well, let's go ahead and talk about how to get money into these, because that's going to be the main thing that literally anyone setting up a new fiscal year is going to have to do. You may not have to set up a new funding source. You may not have to set up any new funds, but you're going to have to add money to everything. We talked a moment ago about the idea that within those funds that propagate, you may find that you have a negative encumbrance or a negative balance based on what rolled over. In this particular case, we don't have those negatives because we did roll over money, but we didn't roll over any encumbrances. Those negatives are okay. Before you've added money, all that means is that there's the expectation that something's going to be paid for, but there is no money to pay for it yet. And so once you've added the money to the fund, once you've actually allocated it into that fund, then that negative balance is going to get eaten up by that process. So we're going to do that. And just like we've talked about in previous sessions, the first step to getting money into your funds is actually to apply credit to your funding sources. So we're going to start there. We're going to come over to our funding sources tab. And again, we're scoped down to the branch level, but I know that my funding sources are set up at the system level. So I'm going to come back up to that level, and I'm able to see both of my funding sources. And I see that I do have some money from my funding source for training still in there. And this basically is because I rolled over everything from my fund, which means that my county doesn't want that money back. My funding source doesn't want that money back. So whatever money I still had in this funding source is still available for me to allocate however I'd like. So I still do have $5,000 that I can allocate however I'd like at this point, but I can add to it as well. One thing to keep in mind is that it is easy to add money to a funding source. It is harder to take it away. It's not much harder, but it's a little bit more confusing. So one thing that I recommend is that if you have not yet been given a dollar amount by your funding source, by your county or municipality or whatever, wherever you get your money, if they have not yet told you how much money you'll get that year, don't put it in yet. Now, if you're in a situation where you don't have enough rollover balance to cover purchases and you need to start purchasing right away, and you've been given the go-ahead to do that. You might want to put a little bit into the funding source, but I would recommend lowballing your expectations because it is easier to add than it is to subtract. So for instance, if I go into my training funding source and I've got this $5,000 already set, and let's say that right now this is just because it's what's left over from last year, but let's say instead this is what I thought I was getting from my county. I thought I was getting $5,000 this year. And then I get a call from the county manager and he says, actually, we're only giving you $4,000 this year. Aside from crying, because how am I supposed to buy a year's worth of materials for the library with $4,000? I would also be in a little bit of trouble because there's no way for me to come in and like edit this. I can't come in and change this amount. I can't, if I hover over this action menu, I see that there are no actions I can take. This amount is how much I have. The only way that I could change this amount is by simply adding another set of credits. So I could come in here and instead I get a call from the county manager and says, good news, we've got $50,000 for the library this year. Then I could just easily put in $50,000, and that would be an easy way for me to, to apply that credit. I'm not going to do that just yet because I want to keep going with this whole negative thing. If, on the other hand, I have less money than this funding source currently reflects, the only way that I can really do this, and it's confusing and it's for bookkeeping purposes, it's probably not the best way to do it. So it's best to avoid it if you can. The only way that I can make this less is by applying a negative amount. So if I only get $4,000 this year when I've already applied $5,000, I have to come in and apply negative $1,000. I'm going to set my effective date. So this is the date at which this money can start being spent, and the date at which it must stop being spent by. And I save it. And so now it's showing up as a negative application here. And if I close this out, then I can see that I have, still looking at one. Oh, I think I did a little bit of transferring earlier, and that's why I'm confused. But my balance is now showing as negative 1,000. Let me go back in and do this real quick in a way that makes a little more sense than the way it's showing up. There we go. All right, so now I had, if I had a balance of $50,000 and then I applied a credit of negative 1,000, then it's going to show me a balance of 49,000. That is the number, that is the balance. That is the way that I can actually reflect that my balance is lower than what I expected it to be. I can't edit a balance once I've put it in there. I can't edit a credit application once I've added it. I can only change that balance to make it lower by adding a negative amount. And it's confusing. I got confused doing it just now. So we recommend that you avoid doing that if you can by waiting until you know exactly how much you're going to be getting. Worst case, if you're not going to get that final number for a few months, but you need to go ahead and have some money to spend, put in a smaller amount than you expect to get so that you don't have to adjust in this way in the future. Does that make sense? I mean, it doesn't make sense why this is the way Evergreen does it, but does that make sense in terms of the steps needed to take care of it? All right, so essentially the process of applying credit is just as it is when we've talked about it through sort of other administrative sessions. It is a process of going into the actual funding source, And then you can either click on it to open it up and use the Apply Credits button here, or you can select it and then from the action menu, you can choose to apply credit. So we're going to do that for our Laptops for Literacy grant. We're going to come in and apply credit. We're going to apply $10,000. And then we're going to set our range for when this money can be spent. So this may just be for the fiscal year that you have in mind. It may be for, you know, a specific portion of that fiscal year. You know, if you've got a grant, it could be for the period that's specified by that grant. And we're going to save that. And so we now have $10,000 for our Laptops for Literacy grant. Once again, if we wanted to create a smaller amount than is here, we don't have the ability to come in and edit this. There's nothing we can do for that, but we could apply a second credit for a smaller amount of money or for a negative amount of money. And that should create, now rather than $10,000, we should find that we have $9,000. Now, none of that money has been allocated. None of that money is actually available in a fund, which means it can't actually be spent yet. But we have $9,000 that now we can allocate. And that's one of the key things to keep in mind with this fund administration is that your funding sources sort of tell you how much money you have, but that money can't be spent until you've determined how you want to allocate it. So you may have $9,000 for laptops, but then you need to actually put that $9,000 in funds. So you may have a fund for laptops for $5,000, and then a second fund for laptop accessories for $4,000, and you allocate that money out to those funds, at which point you can actually spend it. So we're going to go in and do that next. Are there any questions about funding sources or application of credit? All right, so in order to now allocate that money out, we can do it either from the funds tab, and so from the fund itself, or we can do it from the funding source. So let's do it from the funding source, and every time you leave this tab, if you had it scoped to your system, you leave this tab, it's going to come back to being scoped to your branch. So just a frustration of this particular interface. I'm going to come back up to my system level, and I'm going to come into my Laptops for Literacy grant, and I'm going to check it. And I'm going to come up to this menu here, the action menu, and I've already applied credit, meaning that I now know I have $9,000 available to spend from the grant, from the grantor. Now I want to actually allocate that credit into a fund where I could actually spend. So I'm going to come in here to the action menu and I'm going to choose allocate to fund. It's pretty simple. All I do is choose the fund I'm allocating to. And so this is one of those reasons that you want to have those nice descriptive fund codes, because this is where they show up. So I'm going to go to my grant for laptops, and you'll see that I have the year listed here. So if you do have those funds like adult fiction where you've got the same one every year, you want to make sure that you're choosing the correct year. And then you're going to come into the amount and you're going to say how much you're allocating. Now, allocation is a little bit more forgiving than application of credit. So if you do the wrong amount, it is, I think, a little bit more editable than with than when you're first applying that credit, but it's still, you want to make sure you get it right. Just because people could start spending it right away and you want to make sure that they're not spending money that's not really there. So just double check that you're putting in the correct amount. In this case, I'm going to put 5,000. And I'm going to say This is for laptops only, stuff being spent out of this fund. So I'll save that. And if I come back into my funds tab and I go into, once again, my filter is set to 2023, so I need to change it up to 2024. And once I've done that, I see my grants for laptop fund. I'm going to open that up and I can see that I now have a total balance of $5,000. I can come into my allocations tab within here and I can see the specific allocation. I can see that I gave $5,000 from the grant laptops for literacy funding source on June 20th. I can also see that this particular allocation is meant to be used for laptops only. So once you have sort of funding sources that are well established and you've been using acquisitions for years, these lists are going to be pretty long. You're going to start to see, you know, quite a lot of information in these pop-ups that are coming up. This is the fund pop-up, so you know it's only going to be the allocations from this year, not every allocation. But if we go back and look at that funding source and we sort of look at its history, we're going to see a much longer list than you will see a much longer list than I have in these example ones. Now I could also, as I move forward, let's say it turns out that laptop cases are much more expensive than I thought. And laptops we got a great deal on. So I'm going to move, in the future, if I wanted to move $1,000 from here into another fund, that's much easier to do than it is within the funding source application. So I can just select the, I can just edit the fund. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, from this pop-up, I can click transfer money, and then I would select the fund that I wanted to transfer it to. In this case, I'm just going to put it in the training fund because that's the only other one I have. And I'll put $1,000 there, and I'll put in my note and I'll transfer it. And now when I come into this allocations, I see that originally had $1,000. I transferred some of that over to my training one. If I go into the transfers tab, I'm going to see that transfer as well. I'm a little confused about the 2,000 versus negative 1,000. That's odd. Did I? Just try that a second time and see if the same thing happens, because that's very strange. Nope, it did it again. I'm not sure why it's doing it this way, where it's basically saying that I transferred $2,000 out and then transferred $1,000 back in. That's how I'm reading that. And I don't know why it's doing it that particular way. The end result is what I want, which is that now I've done those $2,000 transfers. I'm down to $3,000 balance in this fund. But I'm not sure why the allocation history is listed this particular way. I will look into that, and if anyone is curious, let me know and I'll let you know what I find on that. And then the transfers is sort of a similar list. You know, the allocations is going to show every allocation, including transfer related. The transfers will only show the transfers. Once I get to spending, any debits will show up in this tab. And so that's basically the process of allocating money. Once you've applied the credit to the funding source, then you allocate it out to the funds. Does that make sense? Are there questions? Okay. So I think your key takeaways on this are pretty much that once you have your funds and funding sources exactly as you want them for the upcoming fiscal year, adding the money is something that you should do when you know what the money is, because it is a little bit tricky to return any money that you don't actually end up having. And then once you've added it to a funding source, it's not actually spendable until it's been applied to a fund or allocated to a fund. All right, so for the most part, setting up your new fiscal year is the administrative process that we've just gone through. It's making sure that your end of year closeout worked properly for the previous year, and it's then going through and adding new funding sources and new funds if you need them, but then most importantly, applying credit to your funding sources, both new and existing, and then allocating the money out to funds as needed. So this is something that does not need to be done, on July 1st per se, but it does need to be done before you can start any acquisitions orders for the year. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, is that you can set the schedule of when this happens, but no further acquisitions activity can happen until this process is done. In terms of other aspects of acquisitions for the new fiscal year, there's not a whole lot that needs to be done with it unless your library uses selection lists in sort of a rotating way. And I don't think we have anybody in here who does that, but if you do and you'd like to kind of look at the selection list setup process, let me know. Just in the chat or on mute, and we can take a look at that. And that is something that I think we only have one library that does that. But it is something that can be useful if you're sort of a multi-branch system looking at using selection lists to communicate more effectively about what's being purchased. Otherwise, the rest of this is not really a new fiscal year setup. Instead, it's just business as usual and beginning the process of creating your purchase orders and invoices and everything, and just attaching them to your new fiscal year's funds. Are there any questions? Well, nothing is coming through in the chat, so I'm going to assume that means there are no questions. So I appreciate everybody's time today. Luckily, we did not have the technical difficulties that plagued us last time. So I will go ahead and let you go. And if there are questions that come through in the future, please feel free to either post them on the Basecamp acquisitions group. That's a great place for these conversations to happen, or send them to me directly.